Thank you, thank you, thank you. Well, thank you very much. It is so good to be here this morning. I've had an opportunity to say hello to most of you here, and I want to thank Professor Melissa Webb for inviting us back and to come here, and on behalf of all of us at the Canal Corporation, Bill Schweitzer, Mike Burns, and everyone, and Governor Cuomo, it is a pleasure to be here with you today. And to give you a little bit of background, I know you're doing some great projects on the financial impact of the Erie Canal, on the social impact of the Erie Canal over the years, and we're honored to help you through that. And I'm going to give you a little bit of an overview of where my career has gone since I graduated SUNY Oswego in 1979, and this campus has completely changed in the years since I've been here. But this is the second time that I've had to come back in as many months, because we were here in September with the Canal Corporation and the Department of State as part of our SUNY Erie Canal Bicentennial Forum. And you know, last year we began the bicentennial of the Erie Canal. It was 200 years since they began construction on the canal in 1817. So we carry that all the way through to 2025, and at 2025 that'll be 200 years since the canal opened. It opened in 1825, and then it transformed everything, as we'll get into when Bill and Mike get up to speak. So we are, through our SUNY Erie Canal Bicentennial Forum series, we've been traveling this year and last year, and we'll continue next year too, across the state to really talk about the historic impact of the canal system in regions across the state and its enduring economic impact today, because it really is a continued economic engine for so many things, which we'll get into too. So we have a little PowerPoint, and I've got some slides, and I've passed out a compressed version to you so you can take notes. So I know that I must seem rather much of a artifact having the number 79 after my name, but it doesn't seem that long. Time does fly, as your careers too, and maybe you'll have the opportunity to come back here and enlighten students that follow you about your path and your career. I was actually a transfer student from Montgomery County Community College, Maryland, where I attended after high school, and so I did 2 years there and then transferred to SUNY Oswego in 1977. And so I couldn't find the picture of my parents dropping me off at Onondaga Hall in the summer of '77, but I was pretty much just as shaggy as I was in my high school graduation picture there in 1975. So I put that in there. So, and with my Bachelor of Arts in Communications, my career after Oswego took me briefly back to Maryland, but then back to Schenectady, which is the city of my birth. And I went to work for General Electric Broadcasting and Cablevision. I didn't do on-air work, but I did production and writing and marketing and so forth. And then, because Schenectady is part of the capital region, very close to Albany, I went to work for state government and had a number of positions in state government. And then entered city politics by first winning a seat on the Schenectady City Council. And my father was in politics, so I had a little bit of a head start on that, but got a taste of it and got hooked. So I was 10 years on the Schenectady City Council, which is a part-time job, so I still had my career in state government while I was doing that. And then an unsuccessful run for the New York State Senate in 2000, but then that gave me a little bit more exposure, and I actually ran for mayor in 2003. So I was lucky enough to serve as mayor of Schenectady between 2004 and 2011. And in 2011, toward the end of my second term, I was elected in 2004, re-elected in 2007, or 2003 and 2007. The governor asked me to join his team, and in April I left office and joined and became the director of the Canal Corporation. So this slide gives you a glimpse of the past nearly 39, 40 years, and I got to do some pretty cool things during that time, I guess, which I can attribute to my communications major here, and also just life. So between spending a day with President Obama and doing some other great things, and of course opening our canal. That picture is, that's our canal opening in 2012, and so the canal is still used to move freight. Those are actually planes which came off of the USS Intrepid Air and Space Museum in New York City, and they're being relocated to a Air and Space Museum outside Schenectady. So we had our opening day and running those planes through the system. So let's talk a little bit about the canal system today and how it is. It includes, of course, the Erie Canal going from Buffalo to Albany, the Champlain Canal from Waterford and Albany up to Whitehall and actually up Lake Champlain all the way to Plattsburgh, the Cayuga Seneca Canal, which connects down to the Great Lakes and to Watkins Glen and Ithaca, and then of course the Oswego Canal, which goes from Phoenix all the way up to Oswego. We say Syracuse to Oswego, but Phoenix is Lock 1. When I was here, I didn't even know that there was a canal system. So it's kind of strange that I reflect on my time here at Oswego and wasn't aware that there was a Oswego Canal. I must have seen the locks, but didn't give them much thought. So it also encompasses 5 lakes: Oneida Lake, Onondaga, Cross Lake, Seneca Lake, feeder reservoirs, and canal terminals as north on Lake Champlain as the city of Plattsburgh. And the canal encompasses 7 of the state's 10 economic development regions. So in short, it's absolutely huge. The amazing fact is that the Erie Canal has really never stopped since it opened in 1825. It's been enlarged twice and then rebuilt between 1905 and 1918 as the New York State Barge Canal. So navigation has never stopped since it opened up in 1825. And the canal is an economic engine, and it accounts for a combined $7.8 billion economic impact. And I base that number on 2 studies that have been recently conducted, which I also reference in the PowerPoint that you have, so you can look them up and go online. One is tourism. A recent study conducted by the Erie Canalway National Heritage Corridor shows that canal events and canal tours account for $1.5 billion in spending every year. People that do things along the canal, whether they're canal tours, bikes, boating, vacations, $1.5 billion. And then in non-tourism, canal water is responsible for hydropower generation, drinking water, irrigation for farms, and more. We did a study about 5 years ago, and it shows that the economic impact of the non-tourism uses of canal water is about $6.3 billion, so absolutely huge. So it's a great economic resource. I've already told you that it covers 7 of the state's 10 economic development regions, and that 80% of upstate New York lives within 25 miles of the canal. So it really is very close. So as I talked to you earlier, I said over the past 2 years, we have, bless you, we have done our SUNY Erie Canal Bicentennial Forum series. And in September, we had the pleasure of coming back to Oswego to talk about the DRI program. DRI stands for Downtown Revitalization Initiative, where communities have the opportunity to compete in each region to receive $10 million from the state to transform their communities and their downtowns into live, work, play communities where people want to be. The Erie Canal Bicentennial Forum Series continues to provide us with a timely opportunity to talk about the historic significance of the canal system in each region over the years, but also to talk about today how the canal continues to drive sustainable economic development across upstate New York. At the DRI Forum, which we held right here in the Marano Center, in the auditorium, we talked about 4 communities that are named as DRI communities, and that includes Oswego, Rome, Geneva, and Watkins Glen. We had mayors and local officials from each of those cities talking about projects and what they are doing to make their communities along the canal more attractive and how the canal is actually helping them in that effort. So here in Oswego, the mayor talked about his downtown housing programs and the Market Square Pocket Park project, just two of the projects in his comprehensive DRI investment strategy in the city of Rome. The local officials talked about the Liberty George revitalization project, which is converting, tearing down a former parking garage and making it into a multi-use live, work, play part of their downtown. Geneva in the Finger Lakes on Seneca Lake has got a very cool project called the Lake Tunnel Solar Village Project, actually making solar 100% energy efficient homes along the Cayuga Seneca Canal and Seneca Lake. And then in Watkins Glen, the Watkins Glen folks talked about the FLX Mixed Work Project. Part of the panel included 6 of your fellow students that were from each of the classes. I don't know if any of you know anybody in these shots here, but they were part of our panel, part of our question panel. So they were able to ask the mayor and the other officials questions. And at the end of the program, we presented them with Erie Canal bicentennial hats. So if you see these guys walking across campus and they have a hat on, you'll know that they're one of the students in our student panel. The DRI program is a key component of Governor Cuomo's upstate economic development strategy. And it is, as I said, it is competitively selected. These communities are competitively selected by the 10 regional economic development councils. So here in the central New York region, the Central New York Economic Development Council named Oswego as their DRI community, I think in 2016. And since then, there have been 2 other rounds of DRI communities in the central New York region. And the whole idea is to transform communities into places where people, young people in particular, like you, want to live. So we call those live, work, and play communities. They receive a $10 million investment from the state to execute their approved DRI investment strategy. And since the program started in 2016, we have had 30 communities designated with $300 million committed to help those communities move forward. There are 6 DRI communities along the New York State Canal System, including Oswego. And you can learn more about the DRI program at that link at the bottom, which also appears on your copy of your PowerPoint. So I said that here in Oswego, the mayor talked about the Market Square Pocket Park. That is going to be happening right in front of what is Old City Hall, the Old City Hall restaurant. And if you know where that is, right along the river, that's going to be a very cool place. And up at the top there, they're going to have musical performances. I don't know if there's a, oh yeah, right up in there. They're going to have musical performances. We also heard from the Oswego Renaissance Association, which is also providing grants to homeowners in the DRI neighborhoods to restore properties, to make them more livable communities. So that was the DRI program, and the Oswego Renaissance Association is also run by an Oswego faculty member here, Professor Paul Stewart. So that was very interesting. That is a glimpse of some of the economic impact of the canal system, and I'd like to now turn it over to Bill and Mike, who are going to take you through some of the more exciting history of our canal, and then we'll have time for questions and commentary at the end. So Bill Schweitzer is our marketing director, and
we answered some of those questions, but I think maybe some of what you heard from Brian and the canal today, and then Mike's history presentation, maybe it'll spur some more questions, but we can certainly talk about the questions you sent in, and then, whatever, not even questions, maybe discussions, because as Brian said, the canal opened up in 1825, and it was it kind of changed everything. I heard some folks were from Queens and Hauppauge downstate. When it opened, New York City was Manhattan was forest, and it wasn't one of the major ports in the country. It was Boston, Baltimore, Philadelphia, what's that? And New Orleans. And just about maybe almost about a year after it opening, you know, it kind of transformed New York. It became the port of call and really the financial capital of the state, and then financial capital of the United States and the world, really. But it was because of the Erie Canal. So we always say, we do some presentations in New York City. We go to the New York City Boat Show, and I said, hey, you know, we made New York, you know, because, you know, downstate, you get a little bit, it's upstate, I don't know what goes on up there. And I said, well, you know, the canal, if it wasn't for the canal, you know, New York would still be maybe a smaller town. But so really quickly, I'm going to go, I just want to talk about the canal today a little bit, and I'm just going to touch on some of the history because Mike does our history presentation for our education program, which is usually for elementary and high school students. But Mike, you know, put a few more difficult and more in-depth history things in there today. But so it was opened in 1817 to 1825. It was built, opened in 1825. One of your questions was, you know, were they thinking about profit when they built it, or when they were trying to get it? Or they weren't really thinking about profit. It was more, how do we get to the Great Lakes? How do we get across? You know, it took about 2 months to get to Buffalo from Albany, and then about a week or so when the canal was opened. It was just easier to travel by water. So it was, how do we get west? It was a Western movement, which was really the impetus for the canal. Expanded, there was, this is the third version, the modern day canal. Today's canal is the third version. There are some more stats for you. Where's the clicker here? What else do I got going on here? There's Teddy Roosevelt. Michael went to high school with him. That's how he knows so much about the canal. That's my my go-to joke there. This is right up by Michael's and my house in Waterford, New York, just about 100 years ago. It was the Flight of Five. The Flight of Five takes you out of the Hudson Valley and puts you up into the Mohawk Valley. There are, so I'm just gonna go right to the canal today. I'm just gonna give you a glimpse of what our canal is today, and I'll go quick and then give Mike the history so we have more time to go. So, and the map will be my guide.
Use the PowerPoint?
Yeah, no, I'm going to go right back to it. So this picture here, we have 57 locks on the system, and everybody knows what a lock is, right? It's how you lift or lower a boat to get up over elevation, right? So in the Hudson Valley here, this is the Hudson River, and extends up into the Adirondacks, and then, you know, you can hop across it up here. But right here, there's 5 locks in a row. We call it the Flight of Five. Engineering marvel. It's twice the lift of the Panama Canal and less than 1.25 miles. So it's 5 locks, almost stairs, to get you up out of the Hudson Valley and into the Mohawk Valley and the rest of the system. And that's the picture of it there. The Flight of Five opened in 1915. So it's a National Historic Landmark, today's canal system, and an economic engine with 7.8 economic impact. That's tourism and non-tourism, as Brian said. There's Phoenix right down the road from us. 524 miles of navigable waterway. So the canals that Brian pointed out to you, obviously Erie Canal is the main, you know, the main canal, but we also have the Champlain Canal, 11 locks on the Champlain Canal, 7 locks on the Oswego Canal, 4 locks on the Cayuga Seneca Canal that connect Cayuga Lake and Seneca Lake. There's your 524 navigable miles, 57 locks, 18 movable bridges, lots of hills and valleys out in this section, but out by Rochester right here, it's all flat. So the bridges going across the canal are movable bridges or lift bridges. And then the 365-mile Erie Canal Trail. The story about the canal is the history and how it changed America, changed New York State. The tow path where the mules pulled the barges back in the 1800s is now a multi-use trail, and that is this green line that goes through. The trail might be the bigger story going forward. The historical story is the canal, but the trail is going to be part of the Empire State Trail, which is going to go from New York City to Canada, and then at Albany we'll hook up with the Canalway Trail all the way out to Buffalo. It'll be 750 miles, right, Brian? It is,
it's done,
yeah, when it's complete, it'll be 750 miles of connected trails, and stick to my side, and it'll be the longest multi-use trail in the nation, actually. So a glimpse of the stats for today. Canal traffic is back up. We lowered the tolls. There used to be a small toll on the canals for boats. We lowered them, and so boating is on the increase again. 93,000 vessels on the system last year. And you can see these in your PowerPoint that you have in front of you. The hire boats are the tour boats and rental boats that you can rent and take your own vacations on. There are more than 300 community events over the year within this canal corridor, and those events is a 1.5 billion economic impact. There it is. Okay. So here's the Empire State Trail. It's going just above the Bronx, all the way up to the Canadian border, and then here, obviously, it'll hook up with the Canalway Trail and go all the way out to Buffalo. That will continue to have an economic impact as well. A lot of planners and the communities, everybody wants a house that's by some kind of recreation. So some of the communities, like a city like Utica, here, this dotted line is trail that is not finished yet. It's still on road. They are finishing that and closing the gaps, as we say, and then development is coming around the trail because it's something to do. You can walk you can walk your stroller and your kids. You can ride your bike. You can rollerblade and get a little recreation right by your house. And that's the Cycle the Erie is an event. One of the events that generates a lot of the money I'm talking about. Goes from Buffalo to Albany. It's once a year. It's an 8-day event. And as the bikers last year was over 500 bikers, I think.
Over 600.
Yeah, over 600 cyclists were in the ride. And when those 600 cyclists come through the communities, they spend money. And then, of course, they come back, right? They see our trail. They do the event for 8 days. But then we hope we come back and those communities kind of open their doors and their restaurants and businesses for them. Another activity or event that the Canal Corporation has created is the Lockport Oberfest. One of the best ones is just a few miles from here is Phoenix. The village of Phoenix comes out. Last year they had helicopter rides, but it is a fall-themed New York State craft beer, craft beverages, and New York State locally grown foods is the theme, and gets people out to the Canal Corridor after kind of the main season is over in the fall. But Lockport on the western end, out by Buffalo, Rome in the eastern part of the Erie Canal, Phoenix, Seneca Falls, and then Fort Edward, which is right up here. So we kind of tried to spread it out, and it's been a really great event, and they're going to expand. We're probably going to do one in Watkins Glen because we did some events over the summer there. So again, I say I'm going to go quick, and I can't stop talking, but I'm going to go really quick, just a glimpse of the canal today. These banners up here, get a look at them maybe before you go, and I encourage anybody to email me after. I can send you these links and we can talk about them. The Library Resource Center went around to all the historical societies in New York State and gathered images and historical information that maybe wasn't in the museums or wasn't printed or wasn't documented. And it is a digital collection that you can just go through and scroll through. So anybody that wants to do more research on the canals or maybe on the papers you're working on now, it's a really, really great resource. One of the questions was on the Underground Railroad. That blue map in the back is a map of the Underground Railroad at the time, I think in 1817, I think. And it's a couple really good snippets of how the Underground Railroad, the canal was significant in it. So everybody kind of, you guys probably know a lot about the Erie Canal, but I just want to touch on the Champlain Canal is really the upper Hudson River, and then it is a land-cut canal that connects Lake Champlain, and you can get out to the Atlantic Ocean or up into the St. Lawrence Seaway that way. The Oswego Canal is important for shipping. There is a lot of shipping that comes out this way, out to the Great Lakes. You can go all the way to Duluth, Minnesota, up into the Canadian canals. The Oswego Canal is also significant for the Great Loopers. The Erie Canal nowadays is a part of the Great Loop, and that is when you get old and you don't have anything to do and you got a lot of money, you can be a great looper. What they do is they you get on a boat. You can start. We'll start in Florida. You spring up and fall down. I think so you spring up the East Coast. You start in Florida, come all the way up the East Coast in the inner coastal waterway, come up the Hudson River in the port of New York City, out through the canal, out the Oswego Canal, up into the Great Lakes, and then down the Mississippi River, and then all the way around. You make a big loop back to Florida, and it takes about 2 months. So that's a lot of money that's generated through tourism during the summer months is great loopers doing that trip. There's also a mini loop where you can come up through New York City, out over through Nova Scotia and back down that way. So that's significant in there. Like Brian, I was in Oswego. I did some fishing here years ago. I'd see the boats go up. I didn't really give it any thought. And until I took this job, I didn't realize how significant the canal was to our history and today. So I stood right there watching the boats go up and didn't know them. But Oswego, very important for shipping and the Great Loop. Cayuga Seneca Canal, I didn't know until I took this job. You know, from New York City and the port of New York City, you go down to New York City and you say, yeah, if you want, you could take a boat to the Finger Lakes. What? How do I get there? Come up the Hudson River, out the Erie Canal, down in through the Cayuga Seneca Canal, and you can go to Ithaca, Watkins Glen by boat. Pretty amazing. It used to be Albany to Buffalo. It is now Waterford, Mike's hometown, to Tonawanda. The last part of the canal, these are the last 2 locks after the lift bridges, and you come down, and this is the Ellicott Creek down into, and that's how you get to Lake Erie. Lockport is really the last 2 locks, and then Tonawanda is the terminus. So as Brian touched on really quick, tourism is a big part of what the canal is today, but it is also non-tourism. Drinking water, there's 27 hydroelectric power plants on the system, 3 of which are run by NYPA, the New York Power Authority. That's who our bosses are, and that's who gives the money to keep these locks going. Drinking water, cooling for manufacturing and irrigation, and really tourism, and that's my part. I could talk about it for a long time, what we're trying to do, what we're going to do. And this canal, although the Erie Canal is 200 years old and we're in the bicentennial period, the modern day barge canal is 100 years old this year. We have some bags with some stuff we're going to give you. There's a reading in there. It was done by a New York State engineer, and it was written when the barge canal was opening. So it was 100 years ago, and he's reflecting on the 100 years of the Erie Canal and kind of ask a question, what's the next 100 years going to be? Well, we just went through that 100 years. What we tell students now is, what's the next 100 years going to be? Are we going to do more hydro power, sustainability, the environment, things like that? So that's really, I kind of turn it over to you. You know, that's your job. I mean, the future of this canal, you know, what are we going to do with it? And it's kind of, you know, learn your history in that, but think about, hey, what can we do with the canal today? We have not a contest, but we did a thing called Reimagine the Canals, and it was a $2.5 million pool of money, and we had 145 applicants come in, and they picked 2. How are we going to reimagine our canals today? So I would love your questions on that and comments after, but I'm going to turn it over to Mike to give you a snippet of the history.
All right, I'm going to stand right out in front here. If you're going to talk about the history of the canal, you really have to start back in colonial days when we were a brand new country and George Washington was president at the time. That's when you have to start. Life back then was a lot different, probably in any way you can think of, but especially when it came to transportation, because remember, you didn't have all the inventions. You didn't have cars, trucks, buses, airplanes, railroads. None of that stuff was invented yet. So if you were alive back then and you wanted to go from place to place, you would have had to walk, ride on a horse or a mule, or ride in a wagon with a horse or a mule pulling you along. And it was very unlikely that in your whole life you would have traveled more than 25 miles from your house because of the lack of transportation. Well, people were thinking, well, what if we had a canal? Because if it was available, water transportation was actually a pretty good means of transportation back then. So they were thinking, what if we had a canal that connected the East Coast someplace with the Great Lakes up here. That was the goal. And the reason for that was we had a lot of immigrants coming into the country and they needed places to live. The Great Lakes were populated, but not heavily. It didn't have a lot of people up there. And once you got to the Great Lakes, you were halfway across America. You were all the way out to the Mississippi. So this was a good idea, but it had two major problems. The first major problem was, where do you put the canal? Because if you look at this map, see, this is an antique map I found up in Saratoga Springs. And I grabbed it because it shows the mountain ranges up and down the East Coast. And I'll pass that around when I get to, whatever. But anyway, you can't go over a mountain with a canal. So somebody had to figure out the route for this canal. And that was a gentleman in 1805, and his picture's on one of the banners over there, the second banner. And his name was Jesse Howley. And if you guys are interested in doing a pretty good story, you could research the Jesse Howley story, and that would make an excellent paper or an excellent story, because he's the guy who figured out where to put the canal. And he did it, by the way, from a jail cell. And he's the guy who convinced the politicians in New York that this canal was a good idea. And he wrote a series of 14 articles under the pen name Hercules that finally got the attention of the politicians in New York. And he became good friends with Governor DeWitt Clinton. But we'll get to that in a minute. But anyway, I have a little arrow up here, and that shows the secret to where the canal goes. And of course, it was the opening in the mountains, and it's a spot between Fonda, New York, and Canajoharie, New York. And if you were to take the thruway, you'll see. Well, all right, I can use this over here, sure. Here's Fonda, here's Canajoharie. Right on this bend right here is a spot called the Noses. And it's a mountain on one side and a mountain on the other side, one on the west side, one on the east side, or north side and south side, I'm sorry, called the Noses, and that's the official name of it. And that was the opening in the mountains where the Mohawk River and the Mohawk Valley went through that enabled the canal to go across New York State. If you want to take that and pass it around, you can look and see the mountain ranges and stuff there. Okay, that was the first problem solved. The second problem was actually tougher. The second problem was money, getting the money to build this canal. Now, again, Jesse Howley was involved in that, and he convinced the politicians that it was doable and all that. So, DeWitt Clinton at the time was the mayor of New York City, and he became deeply immersed into the canal idea, and so he ran for governor, got elected by a landslide, and that same year he was elected governor and sworn in as governor in 1817, he was able to get the canal bill passed in the New York State legislature, which meant they voted to give the money to build the canal. Now, he had a silent partner in the New York State legislature at the time, a gentleman by the name of Martin Van Buren, of course, who was later on one of our presidents. At the time, he was in the state legislature. And he worked behind the scenes. Well, anyway, it passed by one vote. That's how close it came. One vote it passed by. Now, remember, the federal government refused to give any money to New York to build this canal because they didn't think it was possible. An engineering project of this magnitude had not been attempted in this country up until this time, okay? So they didn't think it was possible. And the other thing was, we were a new country, didn't have a lot of money in Washington, so New York State was on its own. And that went through two different presidents, President Thomas Jefferson and President Monroe. So New York was on its own. Well, anyway, the people of New York in general, a lot of them didn't support the canal either. They made fun of it. They called it Clinton's Ditch, and at the time, that was a derogatory remark. So they started the canal in Rome for political reasons. Right here. It was started there for political reasons. The land was flat. The digging was easy. You could have a crew digging west and a crew digging east. You could get a lot done right away at one time, you know. and people would see progress and they support the canal, and that's exactly what happened. People started to support the canal. The first section to open was from the 19-mile stretch from Rome to Utica. All right, now.
200 years next year.
Yes, 200 years. Yep, next year, exactly, Brian. The canal wasn't very big. The first canal was really a ditch, or you know, it was 40 feet wide, and it had 4 feet of water in it, this much water. The sides were slanted like this, so that when it rained hard, that the rain and the water didn't wash the banks back in the canal. Now, when they build canals today, even the canals today on our canal system that were built the past 100 years are built like that, but now we put riprap or rock on the banks to hold them in. And if you went through the canal system on a boat, you could see that type of construction. All right, now, canal took 8 years to build, so it was built from 1817 and it opened in 1825. Okay, and that was actually pretty good. Now, I'm going to give you a little bit of the fallacy. People think that the canal was built by the Irish immigrants. That's mostly not true. As the contracts were let out for sections of the canal, the contracts were given to a lot of the farmers where the canal went across their land. And they're the ones who did the hiring in that. And most of the people that dug the canal were local people, townspeople, and local farmers. But as the canal progressed and it got out to the western part, then the Irish came in, and they had numbers of Irish building on that part of the canal. The toughest part of the canal to build was the Niagara escarpment at Lockport. And they had to blast through the rock. It was all rock, and if you go out there today, you can take a tour boat up through the double lock into the escarpment, and right next to the present-day locks is the original Flight of 5 locks. They're still there, and they're the original locks from the original Erie Canal. And the people out in that area, the Lockport area, want to restore them, and they've already done one, and I understand now they're working on doing more with the gates, with the big beams that they open by hand and all that stuff. They have a set of those already there, and they're really, really nice. Okay, now once the canal opened, now let me back up. I got to get some pictures out here for you. There was a couple of inventions that were invented for the building of a canal. The first one is called the stump puller. Now remember, the toughest part of building the canal wasn't the digging, it was chopping the trees and pulling the stumps. Because New York State, back then, was mostly wilderness across the western part of the state, Indian country and wilderness area. So there was a lot of forests. So you had to chop the trees, pull the stumps. By hand, you could pull 4 a day. Excuse me, with one of these machines that was invented on site building the canal, you could pull 40 a day. So a couple of these stump pullers, 2 or 3 of them, get a lot of work done in one day. Now this thing was big. It was about 12 to 16 feet high, and let me show you. Well, yeah, let me show you on this one. It would block the outside wheels. The axle turned in those wheels, and the inside wheel was a little smaller, had a rope wrapped around it, attached to the animals. As they walked away, they would turn that axle with a chain attached to the stump. It was like the dentist pulling your tooth. Okay, and pop the stumps right out. And just take that and you can pass it around. And the other invention was an improvement. The wheelbarrow as we know it today was improved to what it is today for the digging of the canal, because the canal was all dug by hand. Wheelbarrows, dirt scoop, shovels, stump puller, and all that. Okay, now also there was no engineers involved, by the way. There was self-proclaimed engineers that weren't engineer educated. And actually there was 3 surveyors that were responsible for building a canal. And one of the surveyors, because of the lack of engineering or engineers, he's the guy who started RPI in Troy. And that's a direct relation to the canal. Now, once the canal opened in 1825, you had several canal boats all ready to go to work. And back then, the canal boat business was mostly a family business. And if your family was a canal family, you wouldn't have had a home wherever you're from. Your home would have been aboard that canal boat, and you would have lived in a one-room cabin on the back of the boat, table and chairs, cook stove, bunk beds, kerosene lamps, and that would have been your life on that boat, living there. Now, during the season when the canal was open, you would have traveled around New York State delivering cargo from place to place. And in the wintertime, a lot of the boats, actually most of them, went to New York City, and they rafted down there in Erie Basin, which is behind Governor's Island and Red Hook in Brooklyn, at the foot of 42nd Street, which was called Hell's Kitchen. That was another one. And then over in New Jersey on the other side, and that's where they live. And by the way, that's my family heritage. That's where I came from. My grandmother and grandfather owned a barge line on the large canal with the mules, and my father was born in Geneva on the boat. And he was a tugboat captain his whole life, and that's my heritage. All right, you can pass this around and look at it. All right, on the front of the boat, was a stable for the animals right here. And you can see the gentleman has, you hear about mules, you know, and it's a little more colorful, talking about the mules and so forth. But there was a lot of horses and oxen and things like that. And this particular picture shows a horse coming down what's called a brow or a ramp, and the gentleman has him by the tails, called tailing the horse or tailing the mule to steady him. You know, they didn't like walking on stuff like that. To steady them coming down to get them to go to work. You'll see another one over here in the shadows. Now, I'm just guessing that this guy's going to go to work and this guy's going to go in the stable, you know, to rest. They worked the animals for about 4 hours, or if you know the Erie Canal song, I'm not singing it, which was about 15 miles. I got a mule named Sal, 15 miles on the Erie Canal. And then they had to rest them, stop and switch the animals and rest them. Now, in between the stable and your cabin, which would have been back here where you lived, was where you carried your cargo. That shows the cargo hole right there. Now, this picture shows 4 people facing here. Two children on the horses here, and the horses are eating. You see the feed bags. But what they're doing in this picture is they're posing for the camera. And probably when the picture's finished being taken, they're probably going to turn around and pull this boat into the lock right there. It looks like a lock right there. Okay. Now, the position of walking the animals down the towpath was called a Hoagie or a Hoagie. Pronounced either way, it's a Scottish term, and it was done by adults, but mostly by children, you know, God, anywhere from 10 years old on up, you know. So if that was your job, you better have a good pair of shoes. Okay, there you go. All right, now this gives you a good idea right here in this picture exactly how it works. Here you have, oh, I can get the canal in there, look at that. Here you have a boat coming out of a lock here. And you have a long rope. The rope had to be really long because if it was too short, it would pull the bow right into the bank. So you had to have a long lead to pull it actually straight down through the water. And on the back of the boat, of course, was the captain with a tiller usually to steer the boat with the rudder. And then you have the Hoagie, the towpath, which is now, Bill talked about the bike trails, are mostly the towpaths across the state, and pulling the boat along through the canal system. I had a speed limit, by the way, of 4 miles an hour. That was actually a speed limit. Now, a question that nobody ever asked me, and I'm kind of puzzled why they don't ask me the question, is if the boats were pulled along by horses or mules, how did they get from New York City up to Albany to get into the canal system? Because I told you that they rafted most of them in the city, and a lot of them carried grain and other things from New York City through the canal system. So New York City was a major port for the canal. Okay, Now remember, the steamboat, Robert Fulton's steamboat, was invented in 1805, okay? So the steamboat was around before the canal was built. But the problem was, the prop wasn't invented yet, okay? So now what you had is side wheelers. You had the steamboats with the paddle wheelers on the sides, and they were big and bulky, and they were dangerous actually because it was common, the boilers were exploding and all that. So what I have here is a picture, and you can look carefully in this picture. You can see the steamboat here with the side paddles. And that's what was used to pull rafts of the canal boats up from New York City to get into the canal at Albany, and that's how it was done, okay? But the canal was actually too small to run and too shallow to run these steamboats in the canal. That didn't come until 1905 when the present-day barge canal was built. Okay, now the canal was so well built, so well used, that immediately New York State knew it wasn't big enough. They knew we had to have a bigger canal. So they started making plans for what's called the enlarged canal. And that canal was built, started just 10 years after the originally reopened in 1825. So that was built from 1835 into the Civil War in 1862. And that canal was a little more, I guess, elaborate with the stonework and stuff, okay? Now, it was bigger. It was almost twice the size. So it went from 40 feet to 70 feet wide, and it went from 4 feet deep to 7 feet deep. It meant you could use much larger boats to carry a lot more cargo at one time. All right, now, most of the ruins that you see around New York State are from the enlarged canal era. And let me just show you something I've always been kind of fascinated with. Aqueducts. There was a bunch of aqueducts, and they were mostly built from the canal, enlarged canal era. And you can see the Crescent Aqueduct right here that crosses over the Mohawk River, because remember, you didn't use the rivers back then because the animals couldn't pull against the current. So you had to cross over, you had a bunch of these. This was the Crescent, then you had the Rexford, then you had the Schoharie Crossing and so forth. And if you go to Rochester, and you stand where the Dinosaur Barbecue is and look north, you'll see, that's Court Street, by the way. You look to the next street up, you'll see a bridge is built on top of the Rochester Aqueduct, and it's all still 100% intact. They just built a bridge on top of it. Okay.
1860, right, Mike?
Yeah. Yeah.
So we're going to leave them a few minutes for their questions.
Pause at the enlarged canal?
Yep, I'm done then, yep.
Okay.
I'm done. Okay, now I guess we're going to go with questions and answers. And just one more thing. I mentioned the Flight of 5 at Lockport. There's a picture of it right there. They took this half off, so the only thing that's left are these 5. So you had, yeah.
There's a modern day picture of it. There's the old picture, and here's you can't really see it, but these 5 locks are what Mike was talking about
Right
before.
here.
They're still here. They've redone one. They're going to do the others, and then instead of the Flight of 5, now there's 2 modern day locks right next to it, and that's how you get up over the Niagara Escarpment. Now it was 5.
And that right now is a museum right there in this building. That's there now. Okay.
Yes. The question was from Brian and Mike, the abolition of slavery in parallel with the Erie Canal. To what extent did the Erie Canal have an impact on abolitionist efforts in the North, and did the Erie Canal somehow aid in the Underground Railroad? It certainly did, and in fact, a couple years ago there was a movie out about Solomon Northrop, his life. It took place up on the Champlain Canal. The Champlain Canal was a route up for slaves to get up to Canada. But our friend at our office, John Callahan, helped us, and I'm just going to read his answer, and then we can talk about it more if you want. The answer is yes, the Erie Canal connected, and the connected waterways were very important conduits for the travel between stops on the Underground Railroad, particularly for runaway slaves trying to make it to Canada. Boat captains would hide runaway slaves in the cargo holds of the canal boats. Many commercial and residential buildings along the canal were stops on the railroad, and the book, The Final Stop, Freedom, by Marjorie Allen Perez, documents the Underground Railroad in Wayne County, which is just west of here, and will have some useful information about the connection to the Erie Canal. Another is Syracuse and the Underground Railroad by Eva Marie Hardin. Another question from you guys was,
So maybe you pause on that.
yeah,
See if
how about,
if the two students that asked that question have follow-ups, or, I mean, not that we know the answers, but.
yeah.
Okay.
Any more questions on the Underground Railroad, or? Yeah.
No, that pretty much answers where we are.
Yeah, it certainly was,
We can
yeah.
leave those with you also, because they do reference books that you can follow up on.
Yeah, we have a few more, I put together a list of some good reading too, and I'll email that to you too. And I'll leave my cards, anybody wants to email me specific questions or other questions or anything, we can, I can answer them or get them answered by folks that we work with. Another question was, it was about, did the focus on profit affect the environment? Did the building methods and conditions affect the environment? Or did the concern for environment dictate the building methods and planning? It didn't. The environmental movement came much after the canal. They did what they wanted back in those days, and that's all three versions of the canal. It was to get a water route from Albany to Buffalo to connect the Atlantic Ocean to the Great Lakes. The environment wasn't a concern.
It was more geography, really, in the beginning, because the first canal was called a contour canal, and it really followed the contour of the land. Didn't really go plow straight ahead. Mike's
I'll make
discussion.
a comment on the environmental part. The people on these boats, when they were traveling, if they had garbage, human waste, anything like that, they went over the side, right in the canal. And then when they needed water for cooking and stuff, they dipped it right out of the canal. So they had nothing in their head about environment at all, zero.
You got a hand up.
Yeah, I'll answer I'll read the answer that John gave us, because it's good and it goes into a few more points. The impetus for the Erie Canal was not so much profit. It was a decades-long strategic effort to find a water route to the interior of the United States, which could use to transport people and goods and ideas. Certainly the prosperity of a young America was foremost in the minds of canal proponents, but neither did they see the idea of a canal at odds with conservation or health of the ecosystems. And it is important to note that the canal's construction long predated the environmental movement. Today we recognize the inherent complications of combining naturally occurring water basins and connecting them, in terms of aquatic invasive species and manipulations of the water levels. However, we also realize that the canal today creates and sustains an important habitat for a variety of species across New York State. The president of the Canal Society for 40 years, a great friend of ours, he says that it's a 100-year-old man-made waterway, but it is now in tune with the environment. We connect the Finger Lakes with a much dirtier Lake Champlain and a much dirtier Lake Erie. This all is connected, and there are species that really shouldn't be in the Finger Lakes because they connected them 100 years ago. But now that we've done that, it's we can't undo it. So there are some efforts environmentally to change this, and they do it in other canals around the world. But it is, there are now fisheries in between these locks. They're almost their own little lakes or fisheries sometimes, because it's these man-made barriers that have, but they're 100 years old. So the environment is kind of growing as we speak, and that's kind of something that's a future question. What are we going to do with it, or now that it is like that, what should we do, right? So that's, any more questions on the environment?
Actually, I have a question for you.
Yeah.
So you said how most people think that Irish immigrants built the canal.
I'm an old man, I'm hard as your.
Do you why is that? Because when I was doing my research, I saw that too. And like, that's what I put in my discussion essay, but now you're saying otherwise. so.
Yeah, so can
We're
I
gonna
answer
use-
Mike
we're gonna
real
use
quick?
that,
And
use
you-
that.
So the Irish get a lot of the credit because the last part of the canal, the last part was the western part. And that's when a lot of the Irish immigrants had got here, that last 7 years. They weren't really, in the beginning, it was the farmers and the local New Yorkers who did it.
That's
But
right.
then the immigrants said, oh, wow, there's work to be, had up in upstate New York. So they came out of New York City, where most of the immigrants were obviously coming into the country, and they came up here for those jobs. So 7 years into the construction, right, they're now out here and they're almost to Buffalo, and a lot of the Irish immigrants came out there and finished the canal, if you will.
And let's talk about the enlarged canal, because the first canal,
Right.
first Erie Canal was built between 1817 and
1825, and then they rebuilt the canal because it became so successful. They rebuilt it between 1835 or 1830 and 1865, and that was a much larger canal with a lot of the stone artifacts that you see. This is an old Erie Canal aqueduct crossing over at Schoharie.
And that's, and you're
Right in here. Yeah.
When the
So the
Irish
Irish
came,
came, didn't they come then?
Yeah,
Yeah.
so then, when there was an established immigrant population, a lot Irish at that point, about 40 years later, they get a lot of credit, or they did a lot of the work on the enlarged canal.
And let me just add one thing to that. Another fallacy is corned beef. Now, everybody thinks corned beef is Irish, right? It's not. They never heard of corned beef in Ireland. What nationality do you think corned beef is?
No idea.
Eastern European Jewish. And that was a cheap cut of meat. A lot of the Irish worked for the Jewish people in New York, and then they adopted it. So it's not Irish at all.
I have a question, actually, I'm asking on behalf of Jared over there, because he was talking about, he found some research about child labor.
Yes.
Yeah.
Fill me
Let me, I'll read the answer, because you guys asked us that too.
Use the microphone so Mike can pick you up?
Sure.
Okay.
And it goes to your question too, who were the workers? Irish, German, children, farmers, women, and what were the working conditions like? The early builders of the canal were local New Yorkers, mostly farmers and other merchants who bid on the canal construction work. Immigrant labor, particularly Chinese and Irish, subsidized the homegrown workforce in the second canal construction, as the director pointed out.
Between
Yep.
1830
Yep.
and 1865.
Primarily after 1821. Children did play a prominent role, primarily blasting through the Niagara Escarpment. One of the lucky things that happened is towards 1825, when they're getting to the Niagara Escarpment, dynamite comes on the scene, and they were able to blast through some of that rock. That was kind of a fortuitous thing.
What about children working on the canal?
Yeah, let
Not
me-
actually building the canal, but actually, pulling the mules?
Yep.
The
They-
Hoagies that walked along and.
They were young kids.
Made the mules and the horses walk down the towpath. That was, I guess, a form of child labor.
Yep. And one of
They
the
were 10 years
yeah.
old, 12 years old,
one of the legends of the canals is that when they blasted the dynamite when they got to the Niagara Escarpment, it was young boys, because they lit the charges because they could run faster. And it's true. You'll see that. But the Irish were also involved, as well as the children, from the 1836 to 1862. With the second coming of the canal. And the Italian labor force figured prominently in the construction of the barge canal, and that was after 1905. And that, again, because that was in the early 1900s, the Italian immigrants started to flock to this country.
Just another comment, so if you want to do a nice paper on something, do it on DeWitt Clinton, because I only touched briefly on him being mayor of New York City, and then governor, and then getting the canal built. But his role in the canal was much larger than that, over a much greater period of time. He was on the committee with Governor Morris and that went across the state to follow Jesse Holly's route and all that stuff. So that's another thing you can research. and look up. But Jesse Holley would be a great story, and that's spelled Howley, not the same as
Yeah.
the city of Howard, the town of Holly.
You guys sent in one more question. It was about railers. Camden, Eric, and is it Jaylene? Is that how you say it?
Yeah.
Yeah, cool. You know, the railroads, what was the influence on the canal's economic decline? So, you know, besides having an effect on the decline of the canal, which it did, it was also a symbiotic relationship for a little bit. The first regular passenger rail service in New York, and one of the first in the country, was established between Albany and Schenectady in 1826 to get passengers around the 16 locks and Cohoes quicker, so that it could, so the passengers would use the rail because there was too many canal boats and it took too long to go. So as far as transportation went, they used the same route just along the canal. Schenectady, after Schenectady on the first rail, you would get off in Schenectady and then reboard a canal boat for the rest of your voyage west. The trade patterns that were established along the canal in the corridor of New York State are still seen today, and that's the busiest CSX railroads in the country. They run right along the canal today.
So the tolls came off of the canal. They
Right.
charge tolls. I don't know if this, does John?
Yeah,
remember that?
the last
Go ahead.
sentence is, you know, railroads did offer stiff competition, though, and in 1882, the state declared the canals forever toll-free in an attempt to increase the canal's competitiveness because they were, you know, vying for.
And Mike may know this more than I do, but one of the reasons that the barge canal was built, when we decided to keep the canal going, because there was a great debate toward the ends of the 1800s and the early 1900s if the state should even have a canal system. So Governor Roosevelt, who served in the late 1800s to I think 1901, and my history is not great. When was McKinley shot? You guys probably know that.
They actually started the barge canal in the late 1800s, and then they stopped. And then they started again in 1905, and they completed it.
But the reason that they wanted to keep the canals as a viable transportation route was to compete against the railroads. My understanding is that Governor Roosevelt thought the railroads had entirely too much power. So they wanted to keep the canals as a viable transportation route to compete against the railroads.
When Teddy Roosevelt was the governor of New York State before he became president, you know, New York State was, you know, we had the big canal. No other state had a canal. So if the canal starts declining and the railroads were growing everywhere else, it was kind of preserving the power that New York State had.
And I did not go to school with them.
When I say that, we do elementary schools a lot, and I'll say that joke. None of the kids laugh, just the teachers laugh. So it was good to get something laugh. I tease them, but everything I know about the canal I learned from Mike from these presentations.
Now, if you guys are really interested in the canal, one of the places you can go is the Syracuse Erie Canal Museum, and it's right on Erie Boulevard and the old way station. Remember, the canal went right through the city of Syracuse. Erie Boulevard was the canal.
So if you
It
look
went-
at this map
Yeah.
here, this is the old canal route, which is basically today's Canalway Trail, because the Canalway Trail, you can actually bike across the state on the Canalway Trail, follows the old canal. So Mike is absolutely right, the canal went to Rome, and from Rome, it dove down and went through Syracuse and then on to that green part, which is.
And
the
it
Canalway Trail,
also,
is also the old
and it
canal.
also went right down Erie Boulevard in Schenectady.
Right.
Brian Stratton's hometown,
Right.
and where he was the mayor of.
Yeah,
That's
and
why
went through
General Electric
downtown
has
Rochester
its
too.
headquarters in Schenectady was because the business, you know, you transported the goods on the canal, and it was, you know, Syracuse was a very small little village before the canal came into a big city, same as Rochester, Utica. All
So
those
we hope we haven't dumbed this down too much for you. You know, generally, this is a presentation that's given to the, you know, middle school, high school, but we were here in September, and we're, you know, fascinated by your interest in it too. And we can certainly follow up with you for other questions. Any other questions that you might have on your work or just about the canal in general? Or
Is
what it was
anybody
like to
touching
be-
on the women's rights movement or any of the ideas and kind of that part of the canal?
I'll say it when we're talking to the kids, I'll say, transportation and goods went up and down the canal, but so did people and so did ideas. Governor's Island in New York City gets all the credit for all the immigrants coming to this country, but almost the numbers that landed on Governor's Island in those early years of America, almost as many left out of Buffalo and populated the rest of this country, and that's kind of lost in the history. And then the ideas, religion, just like Mike said, you didn't go 25 miles away from your house. I think of the locks as like was the TV of back then. You went down to the locks and you saw these boats that were coming from different parts of the world, different parts of the country, and you learned stuff and you heard what was going on in the big city, right? The women's rights movement started in Seneca Falls on the canal. Susan B. Anthony and others worked on the canal and did some of their promotion for the women's rights movements on the canal. They did parades on barges and tried to just get the word out like that. The Mormon religion was started in Palmyra, New York, and Smith eventually went out to the western, to Utah, but it was done here. So it was like the internet of the day, Yes.
Some of my students have talked about when they're reading that they saw that women pretty much, stayed on the boat and took care of the family. But I've also read articles where women have jobs themselves. You know anything about that?
When the canal closed for the winter, I told you they all went down. I have a picture, by the way, of Erie Basin with all the boats rafted in there. They probably did. And in my father's case, he went to the 5th grade, but it was when they were in Erie Basin, because that's where my family's grandparents' boats rafted for the winter. But yeah, that makes sense. Well, when they were on the move, I don't see how that would be possible to have it, for the women or to have a job. Now, I can remember my father was a tugboat captain, and there was several winters when when the canal closed and he wasn't going through, he had to go out and get another job.
Unfortunately, the folks who wrote the history books were men. So, a lot of those stories are lost. But Susan B. Anthony worked on the canal. She earned a living on the canal. So it did happen. Are we towards the end of the class, right? Is it 55? Are we in? Yeah.
Let me pass the bags out.
Oh, sure. So we got the bags for you. Take one as you go.